Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mohammed Sulaiman. I'm a fellow with the cybersecurity program at the Middle East Institute, and I want to welcome you all to today's panel titled Innovation Nations, which will explore the growing tech landscape in the Middle East and North Africa with our own panelists today. As we all know, the Middle East has been growing as a hub for innovation and entrepreneurship recently. And COVID-19 added a different layer of speed up to this kind of innovation. We have seen a lot of state-led investment in tech landscape. We have seen partnerships between different states across the region. We have seen the Abrahamic Accord. So we believe having a broader discussion about the Middle East and the current landscape and what's the trajectory for the region, what are the challenges for the regions. So I'm very happy and pleased to have our own distinguished speakers today. So we have Ori Ezen, founder and CEO from Tursona, and we have Dina Sharif, executive director for MIT Wrangton Center. Let me start first by asking Dina and Ori the first question, which is, when we say innovation nations, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Ori?
Well, I was hoping Dina would start because ladies first, but I would be glad to begin. Dina, you'll take the next question first. How's that?
Oh, no, I'm happy to follow your lead.
Yeah, okay. I think, Mohammed, Innovation Nation is a misnomer in the sense that many people might have things that come to mind that they're already associated to a nation or two. But I think today is the day to say that we should not have something come to mind. Every nation should be an innovation nation. And the difference between those who are known for it or not is just by how much fortitude a nation would have put towards educating people in the things that would take them to the broader stage, literacy in computers and in coding and so forth. I think those things will help us change the definition. Today, what comes to mind is clearly countries like Israel and UAE and others who are kind of stepping above and are opening themselves up to commerce, to exchanging of ideas and economies. But I absolutely think that the internet is the best way to our planet in the sense of anybody who just learned some English and some coding and understands the literacy of the internet could create the most amazing ideas. There's no more border that we should be thinking about it from a geopolitical standpoint. So I hope today people who are listening to this will think about what they are thinking about those words, but I want to break that and say every nation should become an innovation nation. Dina, I'll switch it to you.
Yeah, I agree with you. Every nation should become an innovation nation. I don't know that that is the right aspiration though, because I think when you think of innovation and you think of innovation, what comes to mind when we talk about innovation, you often hear people say, oh, Silicon Valley or Boston or Dubai, if we're thinking about Middle East, although I'm not really sure exactly why yet, you think about particular cities, right? So for me, when I think about places that produce the kind of innovation that we are thinking about. At MIT, we think about where are the places that have the ecosystems that lead to the ability for entrepreneurs to thrive and produce innovation-led ventures, right? And for me, when I think about that, I think about, and specifically in the context of the Middle East, I think about what cities are actually able to put together these types of ecosystems. And when I say ecosystems, I think about the different stakeholders that are involved in an ecosystem. So you have the policymakers, you have entrepreneurs, you have risk capital or venture capitalists, you have universities, and you have big corporates. How are all these different stakeholders working together? And how is the government and other ecosystem players, how are they providing a space that would allow innovation to thrive? And I think that is what we're really looking for, specifically in a post-COVID world. We really want to start seeing different cities produce the kind of ecosystems that would allow for, and for me, innovation is not in a vacuum. It's innovation for what? We have so many problems to solve. And because we have so many problems to solve, we need innovation. And so if you think about how I spent most of my adult life in the Middle East, and whenever you talk about innovation, everyone's like, how can we become the next United States of America? And, I'm an Egyptian American. I've spent quite a lot of time in the United States. I work at MIT, but, you could go to California and you can spend time in Boston, but you can go to many other cities in America and not find what you would think is an innovation nation by any means. Which brings me to the final conclusion is, yes, I think we should all aspire to be innovation nations, but I don't think ecosystems are built nationwide. I think ecosystems are built in cities and particular localities where different stakeholders, local stakeholders can work together. And we saw that happen in Boulder. And we saw that happen in Detroit after the bankruptcy and how they had to rebuild their economy. Different stakeholders came together to start working together to allow for new entrepreneurs to produce the kind of ventures required to solve the problems that they were facing.
Excellent. So let's speak about the elephant in the room. In your assessment, Dina, how COVID-19 changed the tech landscape in the Middle East and North Africa?
How did COVID-19 change the tech landscape in the Middle East and North Africa? So I think we've been in the process of seeing a rapidly changing landscape already pre-COVID. And when I say that, I say we already saw some interesting ventures arise and scale and become unicorns. Not to say that we've seen a lot of movement coming out of Israel, which we know is already a massive innovation hub, and how their ecosystem functions is quite unique. But when you see a unicorn like Careem emerge, or when you see Suit.com be acquired by Amazon, and then we saw in Egypt, and this was during COVID, but pre-COVID, we saw Fawry, which is the largest fintech company in MENA. We saw them IPO, and that they also became a unicorn. So I think we were well underway in seeing the landscape transform, especially as we also saw, I think, a significant increase in venture capital being invested in the region. Although most of that venture capital was coming from outside of the region, over the past year in COVID, we've seen deals close, we've seen new venture capital funds arise, we've seen local money and local resources go into those funds. And for me, that's always an indicator that the landscape is rapidly shifting. But if I were to say, what has COVID done to expedite certain sectors, I would say when you look at fintech, and you see the number of countries that rapidly changed their regulations, my own country, Egypt included. And when you see the number of startups in a particular space increase exponentially, it means that COVID finally was able to open the eyes up of policymakers, but also of young entrepreneurs as to the opportunity that exists in this space. And I think what happened is that when we overnight had to shift to a cashless economy, you found people saying, oh, well, what are we going to do? We need payment solutions. We need people to be able to access finance through the digital world. And we saw a jump in new businesses emerge within fintech, but we also saw a lot of policy changes, and we saw a lot of more venture capital going into that space. I do think also COVID had a massive impact on education and how we think about ed tech. I think it's too early, honestly, for me to say, as an investor and as somebody who's been working in entrepreneurship for a long time, I think it's still a little too early to say whether ed tech will really take off in the way that we hope it will. But I do think that what we've seen is a huge increase in people willing to embrace education through a digital platform. And I think for the many places in the Middle East, outside of the GCC, I think ability to access quality education through a digital means is going to be critical for the region to move forward and progress. I think actually the real elephant in the room is whether or not COVID will allow technology to transform healthcare in the way that we need. And I think across the region, COVID has revealed just how inefficient and dysfunctional our healthcare systems are. This was revealed globally, but the Middle East, specifically in countries like Egypt, like Jordan, and other countries, the quality of healthcare, the ability of public healthcare systems to respond to this type of crisis, it has revealed multiple gaps. And I don't think that we've seen the kind of innovation required to fill those gaps yet. Whether or not we'll start seeing shifts in policy, risk capital moving more and more towards health, entrepreneurs who are really willing to tackle the kind of systemic issues that need to be tackled in healthcare through the use of technology. I think that is the real question we should be asking, and probably the real elephant in the room. Because I think when it comes to technology, the region is ready and willing to adopt. It's just how are we willing to apply that to really transform some of our broken systems?
Thank you, Dina. Ori, if you got the chance to advise Middle Eastern governments, what would be the right balance between spending resources on digital transformation and cybersecurity? As we all know, the Middle East is one of the top targets for cyber attacks for the last 5 years.
Yeah, I think they have to go hand in hand. It would be very similar to me saying, when you drive, put on your seatbelt. So when you go through digital transformation, cybersecurity can't be an add-on or an afterthought. It has to be hand in glove as part of the projects you're working on, for a simple reason. I hope we would all agree that if we are used to banks in the real world and then we want to have online, that we'd expect the same security of my money staying in my account, right? The fact that we want to go digital should not change the fundamentals of the services before they went digital. I also agree with you that the nation states that can attack, as well as just simple malwares. You read the papers just like I do, and we have complete infrastructures like oil and gas pipelines, or now meat markets this week, that are simply shut down as a result of ransomware. So if you want to get to the next level, and again, let's go back to the innovation nations, you'll have to go digital because that is almost like a gateway to the world. And at the same time, you'd have to fortify and invest in security, because otherwise you will be in the market, but you will not be able to secure your intellectual property, innovations, and other things, or just keep systems up and running. To what Dina said before, if you look at any one of these large startups, especially ones that became unicorns and went public, and you'll see the size teams they have that are dedicated to IAM and security and cyber, you'll see that they all have it. I haven't seen a single unicorn that got investments from reputable investors that did not have their stuff together when it comes to security. I think today it's table stakes. It has to be part and parcel with any digital transformation that you're taking on.
Thank you, Ori.
And just to add on really quickly, Mohammed, if I may, I think,
Please.
You know, with COVID, we saw an almost overnight virtualization of the world. I don't think adoption is in question. I think it's more how fast, what will happen. And I think the question that every country is going to grapple with now will have to be security, because I don't think the question is whether or not they will have to embrace the digital. That's not the question anymore. That's a question we were asking a year and a half ago, specifically within markets like MENA. I don't think that's the core issue anymore.
Excellent comment. And actually that leads me to my next question. As we know, there is a divide in the Middle East. When we say the Middle East, I think it's a false term. We have the Gulf states, we have North Africa, and we have the Levant. And there's a clear economic and financial rift between these sub-regions. The GCC was much more faster in adopting digital transformation, which was needed at the early weeks of COVID-19, but we didn't really see that much in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, because they didn't really have the same state resources. If you got the chance to advise North African nations, for example, about how to keep up with the Gulf nations? What would be your first advice?
Oh, that's a tough question. I guess it depends on how you'd really define the digital divide, right? I think, first of all, GCC countries are definitely wealthier. Their populations are also largely smaller. And I think their governments and the legacies that have been inherited by their governments are also don't go back as far, right? So when you look at countries like Egypt and Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria, Jordan, these are countries that have decade-long, centuries of history of varying different forms of governance, right? And that is something that continues to impact modern day times. So I think GCC governments are relatively still young, and we tend to forget that. We tend to forget that the government of the UAE is very young. Same as Kuwait, same as Qatar, same as Bahrain, and so forth and so on. So I think their ability to think in terms of digital platforms, digital government, I think the size of their populations, the agility of their government structures, the fact that they don't have a state apparatus as deep as ones that exist in Morocco or Egypt definitely helps. But I think in terms of access, to things like smartphones, I think in terms of access to things like the internet, I would say the region, I don't think that there is that much of a divide between the GCC and the other countries. I do think that in order to truly embrace technology and the digital world within a country, you do need good policy to allow that to happen and to flourish. I think if I were to give advice to non-GCC countries, it would be not to be afraid of entering into this digital world. On the contrary, I think it will solve a lot of the inefficiencies that exist within these countries. I think it will allow for new markets to emerge. I think it will allow for job creation. I think it will allow for economic growth that is sustainable, right? So if you look at all these countries, when they think about economic growth, they pour resources into large infrastructure projects. That's a short-term fix. Embracing the digital world and allowing for entrepreneurs to innovate and to use technology to solve problems, that's more of a long-term strategy. But it has the potential to create the kind of long-term jobs that we need. But that requires a holistic kind of approach. It requires that we make changes in education. It requires that we make changes in policy. It requires that we see a massive increase in venture. It also requires that we see increases in investments in research and development. And I think all of that can happen if we remove the fear factor. And I think that is slowly happening on its own. And I think COVID really helped with that. But I think that would be my advice. And I think the other piece of advice I would have is to really think about how technology can solve some of the inequalities in these societies, right? Like fintech has huge potential to allow for financial inclusion of large portions of our populations outside of the GCC who are unbanked. That can have enormous ripple effects for economic growth, but for things like the inclusion of women in not just the informal economy, but the formal economy. It can have massive impacts on moving the informal economy to the formal economy. I think all we need to do is to reframe and not think so much about how technology and the digital world will threaten those in government, but rather provide them with tools to continue to progress and evolve and stay competitive within global markets. I don't know if Ori has something to add because I think he's the more tech person here.
Ori, please.
I think, Dina, I just had a synapse fire in my brain because I'm connecting it to what you said before, that it's really not the nation that is the innovation. It's more like a city that has the right mix of talent, risk capital. And now that you said that some of the countries, in fact, they are smaller, maybe countries like, again, UAE, Dubai, maybe cities in Israel are just in smaller places that have more population density. And that kind of creates the magic as opposed to, and again, I don't want to say any specific countries, but if you're larger and you have less places that are concentrated like that, it's just harder to make it on a nation level. But let's just say in Egypt, maybe Alexandria could become, again, the center of the world, but as a hub, but not all of Egypt as a nation to begin with, because you're right, it's almost like baking, you need the right ingredients, and then something comes out of it. And the smaller the country, I guess it is easier to do it in, because the amplitude of the government and their investment in infrastructure just changes everything. In a large country, even in the United States, is difficult. And that's why you have Silicon Valley and, like you said, Austin, but it won't happen in every city in every state because that's just like improbable. It's like boiling the ocean.
I mean, I don't think there's anything to stop it from happening in every city. I think that just requires a lot of will and a lot of focus on building up ecosystems. But I wouldn't bet on it happening in every city, but I think we can see an increase in the number of cities that have the kind of ecosystems required to really produce innovation-led ventures. And it's important to create that distinction, right? Because we have entrepreneurship, but not all entrepreneurship is innovation-led. It's not all equal. And I think we really need to see an increase in those innovation-led enterprises, because those are the ones that create the jobs that we need in the Middle East. We need to see those companies arise that have the potential to create jobs, not in the tens, but in the thousands.
I love this debate.
Amen.
Why am I moderating that discussion? Both of you are giving us great takes. So that leads me to an interesting question that build on the comments that both of you raised. So what is the secret sauce for having a homegrown innovation? I'll start with Dina and then Ari.
I went first last time. I feel like I should give this over to Ori.
All right, I'll take it. I wish there was a secret recipe, because then we would all follow it. But I can tell you by looking at where I live, which is Phoenix, which is not yet known as a innovation hub. We're known for other things. I'm part of a group here actually reverse engineering, like what do we need to do to become a hub? Okay. And I can tell you there's 3 steps that I can tell you over the last 7 years I've been part of. And now you can start seeing how the green shoots come out, but it had to be following a specific step. The first is to have the right kind of training education universities that would produce the talent, because without that, it's very difficult to get to step number 2. So it would be efforts like talking to ASU and other universities here to say, hey, when your students graduate from, I'm saying, computer science, let us talk to them so they don't think I have to move to Silicon Valley to have a job in what I just graduated in, which I'm telling you was the idea planted in their mind and their parents' mind before this movement started. So that's kind of step 1. Step 2 is to have risk capital. If you don't have the fuel to take risks and to give 500,000 here, $1 million there for a group of guys to start, again, you have the mind and the ability and the will maybe, but you don't have the funding. And we all know without funding, nothing's going to move. But the third is the hardest one, which is to have an ecosystem of companies that understand that the sum of all their efforts is more important than any individual one. Let me give you an idea. Let's go back to Silicon Valley 50 years ago. Do you agree that Intel without Microsoft would not produce much? Like if you just have chips that can make a computer, but you don't have operating system for it, nothing will happen. And then you can extend it to Dell if no one will put it in a box and ship it. So when all the different participants in an ecosystem realize I'll produce this, you'll produce that, and together we will create the economy, now you have magic, because otherwise you just have competition that does not allow employees to stay and move. And all these things happening together are allowing us to do this experiment here, I can tell you. And I think every nation can copy that, because it's not rocket science to know, but it takes a lot of community activity to bring it together. And then you have the hub. I don't know that they are created happenstance, like instant combustion. I don't know that that ever happens. It's when the right ingredients form together, then you have it. So if you want to have it 5 years from now or 3 years from now in your country or your region, start with the education, the funding, and then the community. And that, I think, is what could lead to a hub.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think I would, I mean, this idea, this word ecosystem that we use often in the entrepreneurship and innovation space, we talk about ecosystems all the time. Some people hate it, some people love it. But when you think about ecosystem, and go back to the roots of what that is, it's a system, and all of the components of that system organically fuel off of each other. And to touch on your point about collaboration and leveraging all of that, in order for an ecosystem to function, we need to create a space for it to organically work together. And if one falls out of sync, then the ecosystem no longer works as a system anymore, right? So if it's a fragmented ecosystem, which is the case in almost every country in the Middle East, including the GCC, where we celebrate their embrace of the digital tools out there, their embrace of technology, their ecosystems remain largely fragmented, which is why we still do not see the GCC producing the kind of innovation-led ventures that we would hope, despite of the enormous amount of investments that governments are making, and in spite of the amount of the risk capital that is actually available in these countries. On the contrary, we see a lot of really successful ventures coming out of cities like Cairo, cities like Beirut previously, cities like Amman. And you have to kind of question what is happening in those ecosystems that is really working, right? Part of that is that the universities, to Ori's point, universities there have been there for many, many years. And there's a lot of research and development that exists in these universities. When I think of Egypt and I think about Cairo, but I think about Asyut, which is in Upper Egypt, and oftentimes people think, oh, Asyut is really poor. Where will we ever see innovation there? And I think, but Asyut University has been focused so much on research and development, specifically in science over the years. If only we would create an ecosystem around that. Imagine what would happen in that city, right? So I think a part of the secret sauce is actually good policy. And a part of the secret sauce is a celebration of creativity and innovation that has to be a part of our culture, right? I think the Middle East has historically always been entrepreneurial and innovative, and the go back to our roots. I mean, science and medicine and so much creativity came from our part of the world, and I think we can get there again, but that requires a true transformation of the way we educate our children and our youth. And when I was still teaching at the American University in Cairo, I kind of carried this flag of, we don't need entrepreneurship classes. We need every faculty member to be using an entrepreneurial pedagogy in the way that they teach. So no matter what class you take, you're going to come out of it with an entrepreneurial mindset, a problem-solving mindset, where we see our young people think in terms of abundance and instead of scarcity, where we think in terms of opportunities instead of problems. And I think that these are mindset shifts that can happen through the way that we educate our children and our youth in universities. And I think that is core to the secret sauce. And I think the last thing I would say that is absolutely needed when we think of the ecosystems that are truly, truly, truly successful and have been successful year on year. So whether that be Silicon Valley, whether that be Boston, whether that be Austin, whether that be Boulder, whether that be to an extent Cairo, or to an extent Dubai, and even Tel Aviv, what we're seeing is that entrepreneurs who have made it, entrepreneurs who have succeeded against all odds, who have managed to scale a business, they kind of step up and choose to mentor other entrepreneurs, to put their money back into investing in new entrepreneurs, into identifying new trends. And I think that is something that we need to embrace more and more. We need to see in the Middle East entrepreneurs who have made it and who have succeeded kind of step up into the center of these ecosystems and help create that magic to make it work. And we have such exceptional examples like Fadi Hondur, who started Aramex and stepped down as CEO of Aramex and then started WAMDA, became a venture capitalist, created WAMDA as the knowledge platform to really share stories. We have someone like Mohammed Al-Kesha, who was the co-founder of Fauri, who stepped down as CEO and decided to start DisrupTech, which is this fintech-focused venture capital fund of which I'm a partner. He didn't need to do that when he stepped down. He could have just, made his millions and said, that's it, I'm done. I'm just going to retire. I've done it. And he said, no, I want to continue to see this space evolve. I want to invest in new entrepreneurs. I want to invest my money back into it. And I think that has been the case over and over and over again in places like Silicon Valley, in Boston, in Austin, in Boulder, in places in London. We need to see more and more of that happen in the region.
To wrap up our conversation, I want to throw at you one broad question for Ari and Dina to get your reaction. So we spoke about innovation, where is the region, COVID-19, the ecosystem, the rise of tech cities and tech hubs. But how can governments encourage private sector to take a much more leading and proactive role in tech development in the region? And I will start with Ari this time.
Yep. So I think one thing that could be a takeaway from this conversation regarding this is, if you think about fire, it requires three things to exist: oxygen, heat, and something to burn, right? I mean, you can't have fire without these three pieces. If we mirror it to, you need talent, you need risk capital, and you need to have the ecosystem. And I agree with Dina, ecosystem means that entrepreneurs who have graduated help the next generation and become funders themselves. That's the ecosystem, the virtuous cycle that I'm talking about. If you want to have that happen, then just look at this as a blueprint, right? Look at the resources, and I'm sure you can call people to help you because you don't have to do it all alone, and start planting the seeds to have that in your country. With tech, I think that every kid in the world today could learn how to code. There's no more barrier of schooling or knowledge, or you just need to be smart and want to be able to apply yourself. There's a famous video on the internet of a bunch of kids that you just dropped an iPad on them without any instruction ever. They figured out how to open it, how to put a pin on it, how to get to the internet, all on their own. And these are like 8-year-olds. So I think if we just decided we want to have a hub and we would invest in the education in the right direction and provide capital, which by the way, could be government capital, like SBA loans are a perfect start, an idea. And to bring that ecosystem, it could be ex-entrepreneurs or people who just want to help. I think you could be on the right path. There's no secret or something that you can only do in a specific place. You just need to have the will and the interest and then drive towards it.
I just want to, Mohammed, go back to your original question was, how can governments incentivize the private sector to adopt technology?
Yes, dear.
Yeah, I think what I struggle with, maybe I'm someone who's always had one foot in the policy world and one foot in private sector, and kind of have like, a dual identity. And I think the issue for me is that we often expect the government to push the private sector in particular directions. I think in the case of adopting technology and embracing it, it has to be the reverse. So in other words, I think what we need specifically in the Middle East, North Africa, GCC, that the entire region, what we need to see is the private sector really understand the kind of agency they have to influence government policy in tech. And I think if we wait for governments to push private sector to adopt tech, we'll be waiting a long time, because governments themselves are still struggling to understand tech. We see this in the United States all the time. Look at how the US is struggling to think about data privacy and, what to do with the Facebooks and the Twitters. And they are also struggling to catch up. But I think what we need to see is the private sector really voluntarily think about how technology is going to advance not just their businesses, but their sectors that they work in as a whole. And you see the impact that technology can have in agriculture, the impact that technology can have in transforming health and healthcare. And I say health and healthcare because I see them as a continuum. We see the impact that technology can have on the finance sector and on inclusion. We see the impact that technology can have on transportation and mobility. Every single system that touches our lives can be somehow enhanced with technology. What we need governments to do is to really provide us with the kind of policies required to make sure that technology is ethical and equitable. But I think the private sector, in this case, really need to mobilize and advocate the government to provide incentives that would allow them to more rapidly embrace technology. Because I don't think there is anybody in the private sector who would deny how important technology is right now. I think it has to be the reverse, as the private sector speaking to the government. And then I think the government really just needs to provide the kind of frameworks required to ensure responsibility and equity.
Gina, Ori, thank you so much. I learned a lot today from both of you. I really appreciate that you had the time. And again, for our own international audience, thanks so much.